Welcome, everyone. Brian, would you like to get started?
Yeah, it's 11:01. We'll get the webinar going. So let's welcome everybody to the webinar. Today we're going to cover cybersecurity, or more specifically, it's going to be more about data security within the security industry. Cybersecurity tends to be more on the IT side. So let's go ahead and we'll get this rolling here. So a little outline. We're going to cover what cyber attacks are not, what we think they are versus what they actually are. Some of the common practices that are in place today. Some of the types of cyber attacks that we might see or hear of in a day-to-day. What exactly data security is versus cybersecurity. Some of the common cybersecurity versus proper cybersecurity practices. There's always overlap in those things, so don't be too surprised to hear that. Insider threats. What exactly is an insider threat? And we're going to go over some of the checklists related to cybersecurity. So, what cybersecurity attacks are not? Well, they're not Hollywood, so let's start with that. So, there's always the myth that somebody's going to hack into your webcam. Somebody's going to try to spoof video from the cameras. And a lot of that really is just myths. It's Hollywood. There's not much gain from that for hackers. So, actual threats are going to be more geared towards data, which has value. Again, referencing the webcam, referencing spoofing a video. There's no actual profit in it for a would-be cyber criminal. So actual attacks, some of the common types of cyber attacks, going after security systems, going after whether it's the cameras themselves or it's the video management servers or even the video recorders if they have the technology that allows the cyber criminal to load code onto the devices or onto the platforms. And those codes would be botnets. Essentially, a botnet is something that's just a little bit of code, and the code will allow a cyber criminal to have the device that the code has been implanted on do something. Today, most of what's being done is what's called ransomware. And ransomware, by very nature of it, means that they're holding something hostage, and that would be your data. So, what do we got? Some of the stuff that we'll talk about in here. So, denial of service, attacks, and stealing data, spamming. So, the botnet, like I said, it's capable of turning around and initiating code that is either going to lock down your data, and by locking down your data, it means that you are not going to be able to access it. One of the important things to note about that is in today's cloud-centric environments, you don't have the data on your local machine, you have it in just a cloud. It makes it a very easy target if you don't have any security around it. And if the ransomware locks down your data that's in the cloud and you have no backup locally or otherwise that you can access, that's not also infected by the botnet or addressable by the botnet, you're at the mercy of that ransomware. Other things that the botnet can do is perform a denial of attack. So, denial of service. So, for argument's sake, if the botnet gets onto a device, and I think it was maybe 2013, it was a while ago, cyber criminals managed to get botnets installed onto over 100,000 home-based routers. And what I'm saying a router, but it could just as easily have been security cameras that access was gained. And what the botnet was effectively able to do was take that 100,000 devices and create a DOS attack, a denial of service attack. And it disrupted a lot of systems. Again, if proper security is in place, that's preventable to a certain degree. Nothing is 100% bulletproof, but the more layers you have against the botnets, the harder it is, the higher the return is, the more time it's going to take for a criminal to go after that. What's another thing the botnet can do? Well, the botnet can turn around and index web pages if they're on the, or if they have access to the corporate network. And by that, it allows them to send phishing scams. So you can expect to get a lot of emails on your system. It may just flood your system with emails, or it may be more tactical and have a phishing email that is more geared to getting information from somebody within the organization that will allow the cyber criminal to get deeper into the organization. So, actual ransomware, as we already noted, it is software used by the criminals to lock up your data. And again, it's going to encrypt it. It's going to keep you from accessing it. And depending on the organization, that data is required. So we'll think about a hospital, for argument's sake. Doctors can't have prescription medicine issued if they don't know what that medicine is, because they can't gain access to the digital records that tell the doctor what that information is. So it could be a company dealing with infrastructure where their systems get locked down. And 9 times out of 10, if you're a hospital or a company dealing with infrastructure, you're probably going to pay the ransomware so that you don't have a downtime that can have a critically negative impact. Okay. Kind of touched upon DOS attacks already. Yes, attacks can be timed. So they don't necessarily have to happen the minute your device gets infected with the botnet. It could be something that takes place hours later, days later. It could even happen months or years later. A lot of times, the would-be cyber criminal would rather have a large installation of a specific botnet than just one or two devices infected. It gives them a better chance of being successful at what their aim is. And as mentioned, transportation systems, public facilities, utilities. Your average home user is probably not going to be a target for trying to uh, for a ransomware, because, well, there's just not much money in your average user. But if we're looking at organizations, again, infrastructure, hospitals, public transportation, things that immediately affect hundreds, if not thousands, of people at any given moment, there's a good chance the ransomware is going to get paid quickly, and the cyber criminal is going to slip away, uh, just untraceable. So, what are some common practices that can be done to help mitigate or deter a cyber attack, or a cyber criminal for that matter? Well, first off, every network or networkable device has what's called a ping response, or ping that will respond to a ping request. Basically, your cyber criminal uses the ping request or command to determine if there is a computer or a system or a device on the other side of a specific IP address. So if the device or system does not respond to that ping request, then the cyber criminal thinks nobody is on the other side of that IP address, and they move on to another IP. So it's kind of like Halloween, when you don't want kids coming up to your door to ask for candy, you turn off all your lights. Kind of that analogy. The kids just go to the next house who have the lights on, who they believe will get the candy. All right, changing the IP port. So you have standard communications ports, like everybody's web browser. Every web page you go to is typically port 80 if it's an HTTP web page, or if it's an HTTPS web page, you don't see the port, but the industry standard, I believe, is 443. Don't quote me, I could be wrong on that, because they change it depending on the system. But that's, again, it's a common port. It's a port used by a large percentage of the industry. So changing that port from standard to a non-standard port, again, it deters or makes it more difficult for a cyber criminal to find your system, or find your camera, or find your device. Um, Passwords, let's be honest, factory default passwords are easily found just by Googling. I mean, we could go to Wikipedia, put in the manufacturer and a device, or go directly to the manufacturer's website and find the manual which will tell you what the factory default password is. Now, there's been enough information and news over the past couple of years from Hanwha to who was the other one recently, which was cloud-based, Verkada, or I think it may have been Verkada was their name. Basically, someone got a hold of the factory default password, user ID and password, and they were able to gain access to the system because nobody changed the default user ID and password. And it is the easiest thing to do, especially when you're installing the system, to change that factory password. All right, other options, firewalls. So every PC running Linux, Windows, Mac OS, they all have firewall utilities in them. If we're talking about networks, like even the home network, your home router has a firewall in it. If you have a modem router combo from your ISP provider, there's a firewall in it. Going in with due diligence and making some changes to the firewall to block certain common routes that cyber criminals take help deter the cyber criminal. Another thing, firmware. So we've heard Windows, oh, there's a vulnerability has been found in this version of Windows. We need to patch it. We've got an Apple device, laptop or iPhone, doesn't matter. A vulnerability has been discovered. We need to patch it. Well, while that vulnerability is still there, it's accessible by cyber criminals and they take advantage of it. Firmware updates, also software updates, hopefully that are being released have the patches or the fixes that remove those vulnerabilities. So it's highly recommended to do the firmware updates when the firmware updates are available. I do recommend due diligence in reading what the firmware does or the software update does before applying it. And this is not an area where ignorance is bliss. This is an area where ignorance can cost you a lot of time, effort, and money. So always confirm what the firmware update is, always confirm what that software update does, and as long as everything is good, apply it. It's another way of preventing or deterring cyber attacks. So before we get into the most common threats, I wouldn't necessarily call what we were just talking about cyber deterrence. I wouldn't call it cybersecurity because it's basic stuff. It's very similar to a routine that we all do every morning or every night. It's hygienic in a sense. And you can look online what cyber hygiene really is defined as, but it's essentially a group of practices or policies that help harden your devices, your systems, but they're not exactly going to make it that much. They're not going to make it a very complex deterrence for cyber attacks. It slows them down. There's ways around it, security holes, backdoor passwords. I mean, these things are found all the time at this level of prevention. So adding layers to that make the deterrence that much harder and that much of a deterrence for the cyber criminal to go after a specific target. So let's find out what some of these common threats are. So we're talking about edge devices. We already mentioned that if the cyber criminal gains access to them, they can implant code, malicious code, that's commonly called bots or botnets. What type of behavior is a device going to show or present upon infection by a botnet? Nothing. You're not going to know. Most devices, most software, most platforms will continue to operate normally. You're not going to know they've been infected unless you have some sort of detection algorithm or software or notification system that will alert you to these infections. Outside of that, you would never know that a camera has a botnet installed on it. You'd never know your video management system has the underlying operating system infected. That basically somehow a cyber criminal has gotten in under the radar and now has control of your system without you knowing it. So, as we mentioned, some of the things that they can do, they can spam your local internet. The organization utilizes an internal network, not just a network that lets you go out into the internet. Um, and these networks can be spammed. They can have denial of services brought against them that will shut down your system, so no work of any type can be done. Ransomware can infect that system, locking down all the data that's on it. So there's a lot of things that cyber attacks can present, and things to be aware of from that perspective. How can we go about making it tougher for cyber criminals to gain access to a system? Well, we can do that through data security. So this is where we're more on the surveillance industry than on the IT industry. The IT industry, just to make the point, it's more about the computers. It's more about the programs running on them, all from an information technology perspective. Where with data security, we're more about the surveillance market, which is about the data that's being stored and transmitted within the system. So, uh, one of the things to bear in mind, kind of like we mentioned with firmware and software updates, well, older equipment is only supported for so long. So, if you do have older equipment in your system, be aware of what the limitations or what the impact that older system or that older technology might have on your network. For argument's sake, you may have an older camera and there may be a vulnerability that's been discovered for that camera, but because it's no longer supported, there's no new firmware for it. So it's not going to be updated. If you're not aware that that camera's on your network, that camera poses a potential threat to your network if a cyber criminal gains access to it. So, what are, again, getting more into the security side of things, how can we go around and prevent access, getting into multiple layers of security? It's not unlike physical security where you create multiple layers to know when somebody is approaching your place of interest, business, object, asset. So, what are some of these layers? So, in this case, where Quartrol is our model. So, what are some of the layers that are presented through Quartrol? But these also apply to data security. So, the first layer is always going to be about training and awareness. This is kind of like where the cyber hygiene, if you will, falls into place. It's being aware of the little things that you can do, and it's being trained on how to do them. So that covers your layer zero. That's your training and awareness. Your layer one is going to be encryption. So your layer one is going to be encryption in terms of the moving data as well as the data that's at rest. So moving data, that's going to be the data coming from your camera, going to the server, going from the server to your client, going to the server to your mobile app, going from your client to the server, going from the mobile app to the server. Any place where data is moving from point A to point B is going to be considered moving data. And one of the things you're going to want to do is know how to, or really you don't need to know how to, but you need to know what needs to be deployed to protect it. So encryption becomes one of the main keys in protecting that moving data. So the encryption is going to be multi-layered as well. You may have encryption on the transmission channel itself, where the data inside it is unencrypted, but the channel itself is encrypted, so it's not going to be easy to gain access to that channel. Adding encryption to the data that's in it adds a second layer of encryption, making it that much harder. Another thing would be to add encryption to any passwords or credentials that get passed along with that information, would be a third layer of encryption. So when combined, it creates a three-layer barrier, if you will. It makes it a multi-layers of protection that the cyber criminal has to address. And those three layers may or may not be something that's easily addressed. Layer two, logical security. This is going to be your authorization, your authentication to access the devices where the data is stored. So it may be user and password to the camera. It may be user and password to the VMS. It may be user and password to the system that the VMS is running on. So one of the things that they want to try to do from a cybersecurity or data security perspective is to have a separation of the physical layers and the logical layers. Think of the physical layers as literally the hard drive. And this is where all your data is being stored. So video being recorded is going to your hard drive. The database that the video management system uses is on the hard drive. The configuration, the if it's an access control system, there's a user database that's maintained there. So these are all physical things that require authentication to access that create an extra layer. Logical layer is maybe more of the communications that help you get that data there, the routes that are taken to get the data onto that spot. And again, it also may be to a certain degree. Again, there's always overlap. It may also be related to how the logical layers may also take into account authorization or authentication. Layer 3. So layer 3 is about logging, monitoring, auditing what is happening within the system. If you're not monitoring the system in some way, whether it's an AI monitoring it, a person physically monitoring it, just a logic rules put together to alert when something happens, you're not going to know if somebody has gained access to your system. You're not going to know when somebody is logged into it who really shouldn't be logged into the system. Number 4, system and application. So this has to do with how robust the system or the application is to disturbance. So a really robust system is going to protect the data integrity. So we're not talking about necessarily protection from cyber activity itself, but more of just maintaining that that data has proper backup, it has redundancy. So you might deploy RAID technology. So if one of the drives go bad, you don't lose access to all that data. You replace the drive, the data is rebuilt, you haven't lost any data. You may use failover. So if in the surveillance realm of things, a recorder goes down, a backup recorder takes over, you don't lose the surveillance side of things. The data may or may not be accessible on a unit that failed, but you haven't lost the intent of the system, which is to record any events that may happen or be in process of happening. It's another one. Replication of the data. So backup. So you may have the data being recorded to the hard drive. You may have the system's databases on the hard drive, but you're replicating it to a second location as backup. So data integrity, again, it's to me the system and application and data integrity, even though they're two separate layers, they're kind of handshake because of the requirements and the intent of those layers. The layer 4 is really more towards the software supporting those type of technologies, and the data integrity is actually more towards the hardware, so your physical and your logical, um, supporting that application requirements. Again, hardware being RAID, software being the video management software, being able to take advantage of RAID clusters, or sorry, RAID systems and or failover clusters. Okay, data security authentication. So this is where we go more back to the uh, data in motion to just kind of get a little bit deeper into that. So again, data in motion is any data going from point A to point B. So video coming from your camera and going to your server, that's point A, point B. So you want to have protection of that data. Again, the basic authentication, which is the user ID and password. If it's factory default, it's really not, it's not creating a deterrence to cyber criminal. So if you have just basic authentication, there's no security on to the transport layer. In other words, the channel or the medium in which it's transporting the data. There's no data security, meaning encryption of that data, making it difficult to be able to view and see what that data is. There's no password security, either meaning that someone did cyber hygiene, where they changed the factory default password. There would also be encryption to the password. In this case, basic authentication means there's neither of those two. And passwords would use tokens, which again, another layer, but not being applied on the basic authentication level. From an attack surface, again, if all the security is just simply the manufacturer's ID and password, do you really have any security in place? No, not really. So what about HTTPS? So HTTPS is about encrypting the transmission medium, the channel itself. This is the area that the data is going through. So in this case, if we're talking about a camera to the VMS server, we're talking about the network cable. So if I turn around and I plug another network cable into the hub or the PoE switch that the camera is connected to, if it's unencrypted data, I can gain access to that data. HTTPS provides encryption to that channel. So unless I have the correct information on my side when connecting to that channel, meaning I'm also in HTTPS and I have the right matching certificate, the right credentials, I'm not going to be able to access it. So HTTPS very simply is providing encryption to that transmission. Now, there are some downsides to just HTTPS by itself. One is one layer more than the now theoretically changed factory default and password and ID. So if we've changed the factory default password, that's one layer. We're deploying HTTPS, that's a second layer. We're turning around. Their data itself, though, is still unencrypted. The password itself is still unencrypted. And though from an attack perspective, it's a little harder, it's not impossible because you can always forge the certificates HTTPS is looking for. So what about digest authentication? Digest authentication is going to let you turn around and encrypt that data. So that's going to be another layer added to the deterrence for cyber criminals to consider. So the data itself now is encrypted. Password is encrypted. There's tokens that are associated with the password, which basically mean the password gets sent once, then tokens follow in its place. And the thing you can add to the token is it could be just a standard token, or it could be a time-limited token where it expires after a certain time frame, which again just adds that much more deterrence for a would-be cybersecurity. From an attack perspective, data authentication by itself is a little bit tougher than say HTTPS by itself. It's still breakable, but it's a deterrence. Nothing is impossible. It's just how much deterrence can we create so that it doesn't become worth the time of a cyber criminal. Okay, what if we put both together? If we utilize HTTPS and digest authentication together, the data in motion has a much more complex multi-layer deterrence assigned to it. So now you've got you no longer have your default user ID and password, you've changed it. You've got encryption on the transport medium. You've got encryption on the data inside that medium. You've got encryption on the password, and the password is taken one step further by utilizing tokens. So this is a much more complex barrier, multiple layers that create the barrier for a cyber criminal to deal with. Now, again, not impossible to get around, but potentially complex enough to make a cyber criminal think twice before attempting it. So, what about data at rest security? Again, data at rest security is what's actually being written to the hard drive or contained on the hard drive. So, common practices of some vendors, not all vendors, but some vendors, is to utilize a minimum data at risk security profile or a protection scheme or policy, however you want to set it. So they may have data encryption on the databases, they may not. Um, they don't have the data encryption. That means the data that's on the hard drive is easily accessible, can easily be read. Someone can just come along, take the hard drive out of the device, put it in, connect to another PC, and read that data and gain access to it. They may have a video format that is considered an open format, like open source. Anybody can gain access to it. So again, there's no security. From from an attack perspective or a complexity perspective, anyone can just walk up, grab the hard drive, bring it home, access it, and get full access to the data. In Quartrol's case, Quartrol can provide a layer of encryption to the databases. There's also more than one database with Quartrol. Quartrol utilizes a multi-database scenario. So user profiles may be in one database, hardware profiles might be in another, configurations might be in another one. So you have a multi-database deployment, and since all of the databases are required to gain access to the data, if you don't gain access to all of them, it's more difficult for you to get that data. So second layer of encryption is on the storage itself. So the data is encrypted and the storage medium that the data is contained on is also encrypted. So now you've got two very tough barriers that are providing a deterrence to the cyber criminal. Secured dedicated video format. So Quartrol doesn't use AVI for argument's sake. It's not an open standard where I'm going to just launch Windows Media Player and gain access to the video that's contained on the hard drive. Now, it's different if I've exported the video. That's a controlled export. That's a non-cyber attack vector. But if I'm trying to gain access to the raw data, it's encrypted, and so is the storage that it's on. You have those options. The video is secure, so it's adding that extra layer. So it becomes a very complex scenario, a very complex proposition to go into and try to gain access or get at the data and play it back. Just not a very easy task at all. Okay, so let's take a look at a checklist. So data at rest, bearing in mind again that this is the data that's on the hard drives. What are we looking for in order to say that we have a complex layer or complex layers protecting our system? We want encryption on the system databases. We want encryption on the archive databases. And we want encryption on the storage or storage medium that these databases are in. We also want the storage protection to have restricted storage access, which means a password is required. No one can just come along and just start accessing the data, even though it's encrypted. Okay, maybe they have a encryption mechanism, but the encryption requires a user-defined password and ID. And if that's not seen in the decrypting algorithm that the cybercriminal might have, it's going to be that much harder to gain access. Secure video data format. Again, we're talking about a non-open source, a non-readily available or accessible video format. In other words, proprietary. So it would take proprietary tools to access the proprietary, oh, that's a tough word today, video. Now you've got, again, several layers of protection for the data that's at rest on your drives. Okay, data on the move, we kind of touched upon already. Checklist to confirm that you have good security or to help, again, deter cyber criminal. You want to have transport layer security. This is the HTTPS, which requires self-signed certificates or custom certificates, or even a third-party company that specializes in creating the security certificates. Without these certificates, the communications is not going to be accepted at the receiving end. It may get transmitted, but you're not going to be able to do anything with it if you don't have the proper certificate. Password encryption. So it's not just a matter of having the tokens with it, but it's also having a hash on it. And what does a hash do, in case anyone is not familiar with the term? A hash is basically a mathematical algorithm, if you will. What it does is it completely scrambles the password, and you need some sort of a cipher key, if you will, to decrypt that password. And the only person who's going to have that key is going to be the recipient that the data is going to. In this case, it would be Cortrol receiving the data from the camera, or it would be Cortrol receiving the data from a client. So just by ways of example, data security. Again, this is the encryption of the data that is being sent through the transport medium or the transport layer. And again, you can also apply hashing to the messages, to the data that's going through that medium, again, making it that much more complex and that much more difficult to gain access to the raw data, which theoretically would provide a revenue stream for the cyber criminal. And then we got session tokens. Again, these are tokens are utilized where the password, which is already hashed, is sent once. Then the token is sent in place of the password, but adding more complexity is that they're time-limited tokens. They expire, making it very difficult for again, bringing all these together, these barriers make it very difficult to access the data that's on the move, the data that's being transported. Okay, what are some of the safest options for your video system, for your centric security solution? So, well, one of them is from a Cortrol perspective. Let's have a database that's encrypted by default. Let's have extra user passwords. So in other words, you don't have just the user admin level, but you're able to create users at various levels with various levels of accessibility to parts of the system. So controlled access, if you will. End-to-end data flow encryption. Again, that's going back to the data on the move. So you want to have it all encrypted, server to server, server to client, client to server, camera to server. You want to have digital certificates. Again, HTTPS in this regard, self-signed certificates. These self-signed certificates are usually utilized in-house or within the organization. Custom certificates. These may or may not be inside self-signed certificates, or these may be ones that are created by a third-party company. And then, of course, you have non-custom, but industry standard certificates, which are issued by a third-party authority. You want to have encrypted sessions, in other words, tokens. You want to be able to have a defense against DOS attacks. You want to have a strict policy related to basic authentication. You just don't want to accept it, because if something has that base authentication, which means factory user ID and password, it's easily broken into. It's easily taken over by the cyber attacker. You want to have enhanced security for the archives, for the video format. Again, this is all the data that's at rest on your hard drive. You don't have enhanced security in terms of multiple layers of encryption and the proprietary format to the video, you just make it easier. But with the enhanced security, you make it much more difficult. Multi-database architecture. As I referenced earlier, Cortrol utilizes multiple databases for all its different aspects, whether it's the hardware configuration, the channel configuration, the user, or the layouts, or the general setup of the system. It's all in different databases. So without having all the databases in one place, it's going to make it that much more difficult to access the data. And again, you've already got encryption applied to all of this, so it's not just a simple matter of getting them in one place. It'd be a matter of decrypting the encryption, which again, layer upon layer, more complex, harder to break through, longer amount of time to do it, maybe not something that a prospective cyber criminal is going to want to invest in terms of being able to get access to. So, pardon me. So, with Cortrol as a video surveillance system, you can also turn around. We've got D2PD as an easy add-on for emergency communications, and D2PD is something that can be utilized to reduce the response time of police. And we're talking down to a quarter of a second response time, which is, well, it's pretty awesome. That's a pretty amazing thing to do because it's going to save lives and it's going to allow much better responses to get things taken care of. It's going to utilize the Amazon cloud for its servers. So you know that a lot of what we were just talking about in terms of the multiple layers of security are already applied there. There's no data privacy threats based on the app stores, again, because we have those same layers of security that are applied. What are insider threats? So we talked about or kind of referred to cyber criminals as, it's kind of inferred we're talking about them being an outside threat, but there's also the inside threats. So inside threats is essentially anybody within the organization who has access to either the physical layer or the logical layer uh, as it relates to the information. So we're talking about physical layers, we're talking about users, configurations, databases, cameras and devices, storage, essentially being able to log into the physical devices. Logical layer being the video footage, the tools that allow you to access the video footage, or again, even the application that allows you to log in can be considered part of that logical layer because you an application allowing you or not allowing you to log in if you have the right credentials. So your insider basically is you or me who has access to data that potentially can be utilized by a cybersecurity criminal on the outside to gain what they're looking for. So good cybersecurity practices. So what are some of the good ones? So we've kind of really touched upon them. This is more just kind of a very one-on-one overview of what we've touched on. So our transport layer security, as we mentioned, HTTPS. You want to have the self-signed security certificates or custom security certificates or third-party certificates. You want to have practice that makes sense in terms of conducting exercises and drills, in terms of how do you respond should a cyber criminal decide that you're worth the time and energy to break through all the barriers that have been set up. You want to have good communications. Again, then something happens, and just really communications really kind of also goes hand in hand with practice. You want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. You want to make sure that everyone knows what needs to be done when a cyber criminal gains access to the data, especially if it's a ransomware. You really want to have everybody on the same page for dealing with that. Data security, and again, that's the encryption, that's using hashes, that's using non-factory default passwords, and that leads us into password encryption. So again, you can also utilize hash technology for the passwords, token technology for the passwords, and security sessions, taking tokens one step further by applying time limitations to those tokens. So it's not, I mean, we haven't deep dived into the technology, the underlying uh, mechanics behind a lot of the stuff too much. A lot of it is just a matter of deploying it or having it deployable within the system. Again, Quartrol has all this built into it. Some of it is waiting for you to activate, like HTTPS. That's just part of the installation process. So on a first-time installation, Quartrol is going to be HTTP so that you can get everything up, running, confirm it's working, and then you take the next step, enable HTTPS, and that begins your first step along the checklist of making sure everything is enabled and deployed to help make a system more data secure. So that's basically it for the presentation. I believe we have some time for questions. So if there's any questions from anyone, we'll get to those. If you come up with questions or if you just need clarification afterwards, feel free to reach out to us and we'll get back to you with those clarifications and answers